Let's imagine for a moment that you are standing in the drawing room of a modestly grand Georgian townhouse. It's a Wednesday afternoon in Bath, perhaps, or Cheltenham. The skies are gray, the windows are a bit misty, and the faint but consistent patter of spring rain drums against the slate-tiled roof above your powdered wig. The candles have not yet been lit too early in the day for that, but the fireplace glows gently. And someone has just set out a small porcelain tray with teacups and slices of toasted currant bread in the corner of the room. Resting on a velvet footstool lies a violin, its varnish a warm golden hue, catching the soft light from the window. And nearby, lounging in a striped robe, slippers, and a faint air of idle intellectualism, is the gentleman of the house. He does not play the violin professionally, but he does take it quite seriously as he takes rain. In fact, because for reasons that might seem curious to you now, it was widely believed in this peculiar, powdered era that the sound of the violin, particularly in parlor performances, was measurably improved by a steady drizzle. The logic, if one can call it that, was not entirely baseless. In Georgian England, the upper classes adored their music, but they also adored atmosphere. And the violin, with its wooden body and strings of gut, was thought to bloom in damp air. Moisture softened the tone, they claimed. The acoustics of a rainy day gave the instrument more richness, a kind of sonorous velvet that simply couldn't be coaxed out under sunny skies. The sound felt warmer, more melancholic, more refined. We now know, of course, that high humidity does affect wood and sound resonance. But in the 18th century, this vague knowledge mixed with romanticism and social ritual to form a mini-cult of violin weather. Some amateur musicians went as far as scheduling their home performances around the forecast. In their diaries, they scribbled things like a fine mist today, perhaps a sonata after luncheon. Rain also gave them an excuse to stay indoors, which meant more time for tea, conversation, and soft music, all the preferred pursuits of Georgian leisure culture. And so, the belief grew not, unlike ivy on the damp walls of their garden. Follies that rain brought out something essential in the violin. Not technically, perhaps, but spiritually. Aristocratic salons of the time were full of such quirks. But the violin held a particular place in the social ecosystem of the Georgian home. It was not quite grand enough to dominate like the harpsichord, nor humble enough to be dismissed like the flute. It was conversational, personal. A gentleman or lady might pick it up in the evening, not for performance, but for reflection. And what better soundtrack to reflection than the rain? In many households, violin playing was a pastime sandwiched between other genteel activities. A short stroll in the garden, weather permitting. a game of whist, or the ever-important reading aloud of correspondence from London. But when the skies turned overcast, the mood changed. Some guests might call it dreary, but the musically inclined, the artistically sensitive, the slightly foppish and dangerously sentimental types, well, they saw an opportunity. Do bring out the violin, one might murmur, gazing wistfully at the curtains. I believe the weather is in the right mood today. The instrument itself, delicate, temperamental, handcrafted, responded, they believed, to the same emotional weather. Systems as its human companions. A dry day made it sound thin, aloof, almost rude, but add a drizzle, and suddenly it would open like a flower. The notes became softer, deeper, tinged with longing. Some even whispered that one could hear the rain in the strings, as if the atmosphere had joined in duet. Music manuals of the time offered no scientific backing for this. In fact, most didn't mention weather at all. But that didn't matter. The belief, like so many social habits of the Georgian elite, wasn't about evidence. It was about refinement, about mood, about showing that one was attuned to the subtlest layers of taste and environment. Rainy day, violin playing became, in its way, a quiet performance of sophistication. Even the servants, who had to light the extra fires and polish the fingerboards, began to recognize the signs. When the clouds gathered low and the drawing room grew hushed, they knew to expect music. They brought the stool. They warmed the bow. They waited, politely indifferent, as their master played a quiet piece by Corelli or Geminiani, occasionally pausing to glance at the weather with a furrowed brow, as if silently thanking it for its cooperation. But was there more to this belief than genteel superstition? Did Georgian society cling to rain and violin rituals as a way of structuring otherwise idle hours? Or was there something deeper, cultural longing, perhaps, for harmony between nature and art? And if so, what did this curious habit say about the way the Georgians thought about sound, mood, and the performance of emotion? So you've stayed in the drawing room a little longer. The teacups have been emptied, the fire has grown more ambitious, and the rain, though still gentle, is a bit steadier now. The violin, our protagonist in this sleepy little tale, rests on its velvet perch like a curled cat, faintly proud of its place in the household hierarchy. In Section 1, we explored how Georgian aristocrats romanticized rain as the perfect companion to violin music. But now we must look more closely at the mechanics behind this belief, not only the acoustics, but the cultural science of the age, and how people of refinement attempted to measure, understand, and ultimately aestheticize sensation. You see, the Georgians were not just sentimental, they were also fascinated by systems. The Age of Enlightenment had brought with it a flood of rational thinking, experimental science, and neatly categorized theories of the human experience. But these developments did not sweep away older habits of thought. Rather, they coexisted. In fact, this era was especially fond of quantifying the unquantifiable. Take, for example, the 18th century obsession with the nerves. People believed that nearly all human sensation and emotion could be traced to the state of one's nervous system. A stiff breeze might disturb your humors. A melancholy tune could realign your internal vibrations. The violin, with its capacity to mimic both sigh and weep, was viewed as especially potent. And so, pairing it with rain, already seen as soft, soothing, and gently melancholic, felt intuitively correct. This belief found its way into writing as well. Diaries, letters, and salon gossip overflowed with phrases like the weather made. The melody more tender, or the damp air drew tears from the strings, as well as the heart. It's worth noting how often the rain itself was described not merely as a condition of the environment, but as a participant. The weather was seen as an accompanist, invisible musician who knew when to add mood, and while no formal scientific experiments were conducted by powdered gentlemen to test the precise tonal differences of a violin in varying levels of humidity, there were musical philosophers who wrote extensively on atmospheric influence. One French theorist, Monsieur du Fontenelle, went as far as to suggest that every instrument had an ideal season. The harpsichord suited the early summer. The flute preferred dry spring mornings. The violin, autumn drizzle or a February. Anything with damp melancholy in the air. These ideas spread easily through fashionable circles, aided by travel journals, salon conversations, and printed essays. A man might hear of a German baron who only played his violin after thunderstorms and decide to adopt the same habit, just to seem cultured. And then his neighbors would do the same. Before long, you had a whole social class quietly adjusting their musical habits to match the rainfall index. It is tempting to laugh, of course. But if you look at it another way, this little cultural quirk reveals a great deal about how the Georgians approached art and feeling. They did not separate the senses into tidy categories. Rain wasn't just something to get wet in neat, was an aesthetic experience. A proper afternoon thunderstorm could evoke memories, shape conversation, and yes, deepen the sound of a violin in a candlelit room. There's another layer to all this. You might ask, why the violin? Why did it, out of all the instruments of the time, earn this strange seasonal partnership? The answer lies partly in its construction. Violins are incredibly sensitive to their environment. The wood, usually maple and spruce swells or contracts depending on the air's moisture. The gut strings to shift in tension. A slightly damp room can lower the pitch and darken the tone, producing a more muted, velvety resonance. In modern orchestras, this is a nuisance. But in Georgian drawing rooms, it was romanticized. Add to this the fact that many Georgian violins were not high-end Stradivari, but rather handmade or local copies with inconsistent craftsmanship. These instruments behaved differently depending on the day. When one sounded particularly soulful during a rainstorm, it was easy to believe the weather deserved the credit. And then, of course, there's the cultural symbolism. The violin, unlike the organ or the trumpet, is inherently intimate. It nestles under the chin. It does not blast or boom. It sings. It murmurs. It was the perfect companion for a rainy afternoon when one's thoughts turned inward, toward lost loves, unfinished letters, or that poem one meant to write after breakfast in one letter from 1774. A young woman in Bath writes to her cousin, "In Sussex, yesterday's grayness gave such richness to my G minor study. It was as though the sky played along very gently, as if on tiptoe." The phrasing is quaint, but telling. The rain was not simply present, was a collaborator. And this notion fit neatly with the Georgian idea of refined leisure. You didn't merely pass the time. You curated it. You arranged the weather, the tea, the conversation, the music hall to create a moment worth savoring. Violin manuals from the time rarely included guidance on weather-based playing. Of course, that would have been too literal. But some do offer advice that aligns indirectly. They encourage players to be attuned to their surroundings, to let the room speak, or to take harmony from heaven's mood. You could interpret these as metaphors, or if you were an aristocrat in a rainy part of England, you might take them quite literally in the end. The belief that rain improved the violin wasn't about science or skill. It was about atmosphere, about cultivating a world in which emotion and environment could be elegantly intertwined. And so, we might ask, were these aristocrats playing for pleasure? Or were they playing for the room itself, for the patter of drops on the window pane, the firelight on the string, the shadows dancing on the plaster ceiling, and perhaps even more curiously, when the sun returned and the skies cleared, did the music seem less real? Let us return one last time to that quietly grand drawing room, the fire still warm, the air still sweet with the scent of lemon polish and fresh paper. Outside, the rain has begun to ease. The gray skies have not cleared entirely, but a hesitant shaft of light now rests on the embroidered armrest of a nearby chair, The violin, recently played, lies on a low table beside a folded silk handkerchief. You can almost hear the memory of its last note still floating in the quiet, blending softly with the ticking of the long case clock. In these final pages of our story, we move from the drawing room to the broader world. How did this rain and violin sensibility travel beyond the Georgian salon? What did it leave behind in the culture of music, or in the quieter folds of domestic life? The truth is, like many customs born in elite circles, the idea drifted gradually downward, first to the aspiring middle classes, then to rural households where someone's cousin might own a fiddle, and eventually into memoirs, novels, and stage comedies that poked gentle fun at the nobility and their delicate tastes. Yet, even as the belief slowly dissolved under the growing influence of scientific reasoning and concert hall professionalism, it never quite vanished. For there remained, even into the Victorian period and beyond, a persistent association between weather and music, between a drizzle and a minor key, between a storm and a crescendo. In fact, if you look carefully at the 19th century British novel, you'll often find scenes where music and weather intertwine. A governess plays a melancholy tune as thunder rumbles. A young lady feels a strange longing as the rain taps against the panes, and someone practices scales in the next room. These aren't accidents of setting, they are cultural echoes. The Georgians, with their peculiar fondness for musical drizzle, had helped establish a new kind of emotional shorthand. Rain meant reflection. A violin in the next room meant private feeling. Together, they formed a kind of ambient, emotional vocabulary that would carry forward long after powdered wigs had gone out of fashion. Even the violin itself, increasingly standardized and mass-produced in the 19th century, retained an aura of moodiness. Composers like Elgar and Vaughan Williams, writing long after the age of salon still, leaned into the instrument's capacity for soft introspection. You could argue, gently, that they inherited some of their tonal palette from those forgotten afternoons in Georgian Parl, Our. But let us step back again and consider the room, not the concert hall, not the cathedral. The room, the private domestic space, because here lies the real heart of our story. The belief that rain improved the violin was never about performance. It was about presence. It was about filling a quiet space with something more than silence, but less than spectacle. Something between weather and thought. Something you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Many of these drawing rooms had acoustics shaped by old wallpaper, heavy curtains, and the creak of wooden floors. The rain added texture to the sound. The violin didn't ring, out-hit, mingled. The tones merged with the hiss of water in the chimney flue. The creak of settling timbers, the drip from a leaky cornice. It was music made not in isolation, but in collaboration with the house itself. Even letters from the time speak to this intimacy. One gentleman wrote in 1792, "I played 3 slow movements by Geminiani yesterday, while the rain fell in steady measure, and my wife stitched a new collar by the hearth. The sound seemed not to come from me, but from the air itself. I found I did not need to concentrate, only had to listen to the room." There is a quiet poignancy in this observation. He was not performing. He was participating in an atmosphere. The Georgian ideal of harmony, in both senses of the word, was less about perfection than it was about attunement, being in tune with the room, the day, and one's own subtle interiority. This also explains why so few of these performances were recorded in detail. They were not notable events. They were moods, moments, fragments of selfhood woven into the ordinary rhythm of a damp afternoon. You wouldn't write a newspaper article about them, but you might remember them for the rest of your life. There is something quietly radical about that. In a world increasingly dominated by spectacle, the Georgians built a little tradition around mood. They treated rain not as an inconvenience, but as an invitation. They treated music not as display, but as reflection. And they treated the violin not as a vehicle for fame, but as a device for aligning oneself. However temporarily with the weather, one could argue, even today, that this idea survives in modern rituals. Playing lo-fi music while it rains, lighting a candle during a thunderstorm, or watching droplets trace their way down a fogged-up window as a playlist hums quietly in the background. These are not performances. They are presences. They are, in a sense, the same thing those Georgian musicians once chased: a moment of emotional congruence between sound, self, and sky. So perhaps the next time it rains and you're indoors and the world seems quieter than usual, you might pick up a book or play a soft melody, or simply sit on if you hear a violin in the distance, or even just the echo of one in your mind. You might ask yourself, did the music shape the mood, or did the weather tune the room? Imagine for a moment that you are in the gilded halls of Versailles. It is the summer of 1763. The chandeliers sparkle above you with hundreds of beeswax candles, gently flickering in the evening air. A string quartet hums softly in the corner of the salon, playing a minuet that nobody really listens to anymore, except the most sentimental of courtiers. The scent of pomade and powder hangs thick in the air, mixed with lavender, lemon peel, and a faint trace of melting wax. Across the Room. A lady in a pale blue gown lifts her fan. Not high, not dramatically, just enough to catch a breath of air. She touches the side of her cheek with the painted silk, glances to her left, and flicks the fan open. A nobleman tall, powdered, and fashionably indifferent nods, almost imperceptibly. The entire exchange takes no more than a few seconds, and from a distance it would appear to be nothing at all. But to the well-trained eye, it was a sentence, perhaps even a paragraph. A complete exchange between two people carried out with absolute discretion, using nothing more than gestures and a beautifully folded accessory. This was the world of the fan language, quiet, elegant code that flourished in 18th century France, where courtly life was governed by layers of etiquette, and where direct speech was often less powerful than implication. In a world where speaking openly could get you exiled, or worse, people learned to speak with their eyes, their hands, and yes, their fans. The folding fan, imported from Asia and swiftly embraced by European aristocracy, became far more than a tool for cooling one's forehead. It became a canvas, a fashion statement, a political weapon, and eventually communication device. By the middle of the century, the language of the fan had become something of a legend in fashionable circles. Books were written. Etiquette guides listed meanings for each motion, some sincere, others playfully exaggerated. To touch the closed fan to your lips meant follow me. To open the fan slowly and hide your eyes meant I admire you from afar. To snap it shut and turn away meant your advances are unwelcome. Even the speed at which a fan was fanned could carry meaning. Slow meant contemplation. Rapid meant excitement, or perhaps nervousness. Now, it must be said that much of this was never truly standardized. There was no official fan dictionary, approved by the king. But that was precisely what made it so fascinating. The language was improvised, hyperlocal, and dependent on the people involved. Like a shared joke or a private code, it was built through glances, context, and prior understanding. One couple might use the fan to signal a meeting in the garden. Another might use it to signal the need for a quick escape from an awkward conversation. It was also a language of exclusion. If you didn't know the kodor weren't meant to, you were left out. Young women at court were taught how to flutter a fan before they were taught to write letters. And while their brothers were off learning Latin, they were learning how to disguise curiosity, irritation, or intrigue with a twitch of the wrist, where gossip was the real currency. And alliances shifted with the weather. This silent vocabulary became essential. You could not afford to be too direct. You might be overheard or misunderstood. But if your conversation happened in the movements of a lace-edged fan, it could be as specific or as vague as you wished. It was also, quite literally, an art form. Fans were painted with extraordinary detail landscapes, birds, pastoral scenes, allegories, and sometimes secret symbols hidden in the brushstrokes. Lovers might exchange fans with personal meanings woven into the images. A painted orange tree might reference a shared letter. A bluebird could stand in for a whispered phrase. Entire romances were conducted with barely a word. And this was not limited to Versailles. Across France and, eventually, across Europe, fashionable circles adopted the practice. In Vienna, Madrid, London, and the salons of Warsaw, folding fans became tools of both flirtation and resistance. In Spanish colonies, Creole aristocrats adapted the tradition into their own codes, often embedding indigenous and African symbols into the fan's decoration. The political dimensions were never far behind. During the French Revolution, some fans were smuggled into prisons, carrying messages beneath their painted folds. Some revolutionaries used fans with secret panels that could be opened to reveal small notes or insignia. One popular motif in the 1780s was the Liberty fan, painted with revolutionary slogans and symbols, but designed to look innocuous to casual observers. Even Napoleon's early court, though far more militarized than the Ancien Regime, retained some of the tradition. Josephine Bonaparte was a noted collector of fans and is said to have used one to signal to her attendants during formal occasions. Her fans, like her gowns, were understated, but carefully chosen, each one speaking volumes if you knew what to look for. But back in the grand salons of the 1760s, the fan remained at its most powerful, not as a political object, but as an emotional instrument. You could hide behind it, peek over it, close it with flair, drop it on purpose. Each gesture told a story. And for the many women at court who were forbidden from expressing themselves too boldly, the fan became a kind of soft rebellion. You could send a message in public that only one person in the room would understand. And so, the question becomes, how did people learn these signals? Were they passed from mother to daughter, whispered at midnight by candlelight, or did one simply absorb them slowly by watching the elegant hands of one's elders flutter and pause and sweep through the air? And even more intriguingly, how many messages were never received? You are now a little deeper inside the salon, not the glittering public gathering, but the private back room. The servants have cleared away the remnants of tea. The candles have burned an inch lower, and the conversation has grown softer, more speculative. In this quieter space, where ladies unlace their gowns and adjust the powder in their wigs, the fan is no longer just a performance piece. It is a diary, a disguise, and, for some, a weapon. Let us talk, then, not just about how fans were used to communicate, but why, to begin with, fans offered something precious in aristocratic life: plausible deniability. In a world where directness could be fatal socially or politically, coded fan gesture was the ideal form of suggestion. If a noblewoman tilted her fan to the left and looked pointedly at a gentleman across the room, she could later claim she was merely fanning herself. If she fluttered it rapidly during a dull political toast, it might be taken as nerves or disdain. It depended entirely on who was watching and what they thought they saw. This ambiguity was not a flaw, was the feature. It allowed for flexibility, for nuance, for double meanings. It gave women, especially women of high status, bound tightly by rules, subtle lever of control in environments where overt power was usually held by men. But it wasn't just the gestures that carried meaning. The fans themselves, as physical objects, were dense with symbolism. Their materials, their imagery, even their sound could speak volumes. A fan made of mother-of-pearl ribs with a hand-painted pastoral scene might suggest a lady's refined taste and cultivated innocence. A darker fan made with black lace or ebony wood might carry an air of mourning mystery or restrained sensuality. The choice of fan for an evening event was as deliberate as the choice of jewelry. It might be changed mid-evening to reflect a change in mood or purpose. Some women traveled with small collections kept in fitted velvet cases, each fan marked for a different occasion: flattery, flirtation, refusal, alliance. The craft behind these items was exquisite. In Paris, skilled evangellists, fan makers, worked in tiny workshops, often with teams of painters, carvers, and silk workers. These fans were not mass-produced, but created with careful attention to detail. A single fan might include over a dozen miniature paintings, gilded ribs, delicate lace, and even embedded sequins or mica to catch candlelight. Many were commissioned as gifts. A fan might carry a portrait of the recipient's estate, a meaningful motto, or a painted figure with the face of a lover discreetly worked into a crowd. Others included religious scenes, mythological allegories, or classical themes, acceptable enough to be fashionable, but easily repurposed for hidden meanings. A woman who carried a fan painted with Penelope waiting for Odysseus might very well be making a sly commentary on her own husband's prolonged absence. And though the language of the fan was not officially codified, certain common signals became widely accepted. Popular ladies' magazines of the day published humorous guides to the gestures. Though these were often intended more for amusement than instruction, still they spread the idea, the impression that every movement of the hand might mean something more. This mixture of actual code and imagined meaning created an atmosphere of constant interpretation. Every gesture might be intentional. Every flick of the wrist might be part of a silent novel unfolding between the fans and faces of the room. The result was a kind of ballet of discretion, a dance of wit and subtext, particularly in a society where spoken flirtation was heavily policed. Men, too, occasionally used fans, particularly in warmer climates or during masquerade events. But the fan was primarily associated with women's communication. And this is part of what made it revolutionary. In a rigid social structure that confined female expression to carefully approved scripts, the folding fan became a space for improvisation, resistance, and wit. In many ways, it echoed other secret languages of the time, like the language of flowers or the color-coded ribbons worn in public demonstrations. But unlike those, the fan had the advantage of motion. It wasn't simply a symbol. It was a living tool performed in real time. A woman could react to a change in mood, a new arrival, or an unfolding political situation, all without saying a word. There is something deeply human about this, about our need to speak when we're not allowed to speak, to leave a trace, to nudge, to reply. The language of the fan was fragile and easily misunderstood, but that, too, was part of its charm. It allowed aristocratic women, so often dismissed as frivolous or ornamental, to be clever, strategic, and emotionally articulate within the constraints of their world. And yet, for every message received, how many were lost? How many misunderstood gestures led to confusion? How many glances passed unnoticed? How many hours were spent rehearsing a movement that the intended recipients simply didn't recognize? Us to one of the more overlooked truths about fan language. It required not just dexterity, but hope. Hope that someone was watching, that someone cared to understand. That even in a room of powdered strangers and practiced smiles, a flicker of shared meaning could take place. And in that sense, the fan was not merely a tool for manipulation or mischief. It was an instrument of connection. But as the century wore on and revolutions began to stir in the drawing rooms and streets of France, what happened to these delicate signals? Did they survive the fall of the aristocracy? Or were they swept away along with powdered wigs and etiquette handbooks? The air in Paris in the late 1780s began to thicken, not with perfume or powder, but with smoke, with anger, with whispers no longer hidden behind fans, but shouted in streets and salons. The quiet communication of the aristocracy was slowly giving way to something much louder, much more dangerous: revolution. Let us return once more to the folding fan, but this time as a symbol not of flirtation, but of a world in decline. For while the fan had flourished as a tool of subtlety, it would not survive the storm of directness that was about to sweep through France in the early days of the Revolution. Some noble women still carried fans to the theater or to court, those places that had not yet collapsed under the weight of political change. But the fan's role as a symbol of aristocratic leisure, its ornate materials and coded gestures, began to feel not charming but offensive. In a time when bread was scarce, who could defend a woman sending romantic signals on hand-painted silk? The Revolution turned the culture of gestures upside down. Where once the movement of a fan had been enough to convey a refusal or a longing, now only declarations mattered. Loyalty had to be stated openly. Allegiances were sworn with oaths, not eye contact. Spies among resistance groups, they were not housed in the salons. They lived in basements, in prisons, in narrow, dark corridors of survival. Even before the guillotine silenced many of the fan-wielding class, fashion itself had shifted. The high wigs and embroidered gowns of the Anzan regime were abandoned in favor of simplicity. Women wore the robe and chemise, a loose, white muslin dress modeled on classical Greek styles. Powdered faces gave way to a more natural look. In this new age of radical clarity, the folding fan, with its glitter, its flirtation, its silent codes, felt like a relic. Still, it did not vanish all at once. Like many cultural objects, the fan clung to the edges of history. It survived in more modest forms, often among the rising bourgeoisie. Simple fans made of paper and wood were still used to cool the face or swat insects. But the days of using a fan to convey layered messages across a ballroom were gone. The art had vanished like a language whose last fluent speakers had suddenly been silenced. And yet, something about the fan remained in the collective memory. In the 19th century, as France lurched between empires and republics, there was a mild resurgence of interest in the objects of the past. Nostalgia took root. The Romantic poets wrote about powdered ladies and masked balls. Theatrical performances often featured fans as props of lost elegance. Collectors began to search for old examples of painted fans, some of which had, by then, been carefully preserved in lacquered cases, passed down as heirlooms or hidden away during the Terror in England and other parts of Europe, where the aristocracy had been shaken but not toppled. Fans remained in use for another century. The Victorians, with their love of codes and proper behavior, even revived and codified a so-called language of the fan. Though this was more a whimsical parlor game than a serious form of communication. Fan language pamphlets were printed with tidy lists. Holding the fan in the left hand, I am desirous of your acquaintance. Touching the tip to the lips, you may kiss me. Opening the fan slowly, wait for me. Dropping the fan, we will be friends. These were charming, if not entirely practical. There is little evidence that women of the Victorian era used fans to communicate with the same frequency or intent as their 18th century French predecessors. But the idea persisted that a fan could be more than a fan. Today, museums hold exquisite examples of these fans. They sit behind glass, delicate and unmoving. Their paintings have faded a little. Their silk ribs sometimes yellowed by time. But they remain artifacts, not just of fashion, but of communication, silent scripts. What do we do with this memory now? Perhaps there is something to be learned from this quiet history. In a world increasingly dominated by overt expression, there is a peculiar charm in the idea that once a flick of silk and ivory could say what 1,000 words might not. That in an age of strict rules and surveillance, women carved out a space, however small and fragile, for expression, for strategy, for sly rebellion. That folding fan reminds us that communication need not be loud to be powerful, that coded signals can carry truth, that the flutter of a hand might carry the weight of a secret. Of course, such subtlety comes with risk. Messages can be lost. Meanings can be misunderstood. Power can evaporate the moment a gesture is not seen or not believed. Part of what made the fan language so precious required presence, attention, a willingness to look and to really see. And maybe, just maybe, some of those messages still hang in the air, waiting to be understood. A forgotten glance painted, seen, a secret shared centuries ago on a silk leaf, trembling in candlelight. If you were to walk along the shores of ancient Greece, especially near a temple dedicated to Poseidon, you might notice something odd, not just the distant sound of crashing waves or the briny scent of seaweed, but perhaps the ruins of a stone fountain, not a typical freshwater spring, but one curiously laced with salt, useless for drinking, oddly placed, and possibly, according to local myth, created by a god in a fit of envy. Poseidon, god of the sea, of earthquakes, of horses, yes, horses, and of salty temperaments, was not exactly known for his humility. He is often depicted with his trident raised, beard curling like ocean foam, eyes like storm clouds, and an ever-present need to prove his superiority to mortals, to fellow gods, and occasionally to animals. This is, oddly enough, a story about that, about a moment in myth when Poseidon was outshone by a horse and decided, like many insecure divine figures, to overcompensate the result. A saltwater fountain built in rocky defiance. A reminder carved into the land itself that Poseidon would not be ignored. But before we dive into the fountain quite literally, we need to understand the context. The mythological world of the ancient Greeks was full of competitions. Competed for cities, lovers, titles, and even kitchen utensils, if Homeric side tales are to be believed. Among the most famous competitions was the one for the city of Athens. According to a myth most famously told by ancient sources like Apollodorus and Pausanias, the city we now call Athens was once unnamed. The gods looked down and saw a fertile region blessed with olive groves and rivers, nestled between mountains and sea. A fine place for worship. Naturally, two gods laid claim to it. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war strategy, and Poseidon, god of the sea and of making dramatic entrances. To resolve the matter, the gods declared a contest. Each deity would offer a gift to the city. The people, or, in some versions, King Cecrops, who was half man, half serpent, because Greek mythology likes to keep things visually unsettling, would choose the better offering. Poseidon went first. With a theatrical stomp of his trident on the Acropolis rock, he summoned forth a spring. The ground cracked open. Water gushed out. It was powerful, impressive, and entirely salty. Salty because, of course, Poseidon was god of the sea and not quite in control of his recipe book. Still, there it was, a flowing fountain. Miraculous in origin, inconvenient in taste. Then came Athena. She walked forward and, with far less noise, planted a small olive branch. From the dry earth rose the very first olive tree. It promised wood for building, leaves for wreaths, oil for cooking, and light. The people, or Cecrops Jews, Athena's gift. The city was named Athens. Poseidon, predictably, did not take the rejection well. But the strange thing is that this is not where the story ends. Because, in some lesser-known versions of the tale, Poseidon tried to make another case for himself. If salt water wasn't convincing, maybe something more majestic would do the trick. So, he offered a horse. A horse. Why? Well, in mythology, Poseidon was also considered the creator of horses. This might feel like a strange pairing, waves and hooves, but the Greeks didn't see it that way. The sea was powerful, uncontrollable, and wild. So were horses. Connection made poetic, if not practical, sense. And, more significantly, Poseidon's association with horses allowed him to embody both stormy fury and raw muscular grace. Now, the myths differ on the details. In one version, Poseidon created the first horse by striking the ground with his trident not for a spring this time, but for a living creature. The horse burst forth from the earth, strong and swift, like a wave galloping across land. In another variation, Poseidon created the horse in an attempt to impress Demeter. She had challenged him to create the most beautiful animal. He worked tirelessly, inventing many creatures, some less elegant than others, until he finally produced the horse, after which he lost interest in the courtship altogether. Typical divine behavior. In either version, what matters for our story is that Poseidon associated himself deeply with horses. They were symbols of his creative power. They embodied his attempt to be not just mighty, but admired. So, after Athena's olive tree was chosen, Poseidon supposedly tried to win back public favor with this magnificent creature. He summoned a sleek, muscular horse from the ground. Mane flowed like surf. Its eyes were like twin pearls. It snorted steam and thundered across the plains. Surely, this was a gift more glorious than an olive tree. But the people of Athens were not moved. They were farmers. They wanted shade and food, not speed. Olive oil was practical. Horses were expensive to feed and difficult to house. Crucially, they remembered the saltwater fountain. The mistake. Poseidon had already failed once. A second attempt, however elegant, only reinforced the idea that he was trying too hard, that he couldn't accept loss, that he was, in fact, insecure. And so, again, Athena's gift stood taller. The horse was admired, but the olive tree was chosen. Twice now, Poseidon had lost the competition. It is in this context, then, that the legend of the salt fountain becomes something more symbolic. In many Greek temples to Poseidonus, Sicily, at Cape Sunion and the Acropolis, there were carved stone basins or depressions set to mark the spot where his trident struck the rock. Some of these places would fill with seawater, particularly during storms or high tide, reinforcing the myth. Whether or not any horse was ever seen galloping around these temples, the salty spring remained useless, a physical reminder of rejection, a monument to a god's wounded pride. But the story doesn't end there, because, in classic Greek fashion, a failed gesture can still be repurposed. Over time, the salt fountain came to be seen not just as a failed gift, but as a symbol of divine power. The fact that the water was undrinkable mattered less than the fact that it was there at all, flowing from rock. Summoned by a god, pilgrims visited the site. Priests poured libations. Offerings were made to Poseidon, not for his success, but for his persistence. His salt spring became a place of solemnity, of reflection. After all, the sea is not always kind. The fountain still trickled quietly long after the horse had galloped off into legend. You might think that after losing the naming rights to Athens, not once, but arguably twice, Poseidon would let the matter go, accept his place as god of the sea, earthquakes, and equine elegance, and move on. But Greek mythology doesn't really do closure. Instead, the gods seem to stew. They linger over insults. They revisit ancient slights with the obsessive energy of someone replaying an argument in their head centuries after it ended. And, in Poseidon's case, the salt fountain left behind on the Acropolis wasn't just a physical landmark, was, in many ways, a silent protest. A briny monument to a god who could not bear to be forgotten. As you might expect, Poseidon's jealousy didn't stop at Athens. In fact, its rivalry with other gods and even mortals extended well beyond olive trees and ungrateful city founders. The horse, his proudest invention, became a recurring motif. It trotted through his myths like a thread of thunder, connecting stories of power, rage, and the divine need for validation. Consider, for instance, the curious story of Pegasus, the winged horse, born not from love or invention, but from violence and blood. According to myth, Pegasus sprang from the neck of the Gorgon Medusa after she was slain by Perseus. Poseidon, it was said, had once pursued Medusa, depending on the version, either seducing or assaulting her in Athena's temple, an act which, in another display of divine injustice, led to Medusa being cursed, not Poseidon. Out of that tragic event came a creature of great beauty, Pegasus, the winged horse who would later be tamed by Bellerophon and help him fight the Chimera. But where did Pegasus get his wings? That detail is never entirely explained. Some say Poseidon gave them. Others claim it was simply the magic of the Gorgon's blood. Either way, Poseidon's connection to horses once again appears, not as a moment of creation, but as a sort of mythological watermark, his pride, his reach, his legacy. Then there's the peculiar tale of hippocamps, the seahorses, not just horses that could swim, but actual mythological creatures, front halves of horses with tails of fish. These creatures pulled Poseidon's chariot through the sea, often depicted in ancient Greek art with elegant curling tails and proud, galloping legs. Their very existence reveals how deeply Poseidon merged the symbols of land and sea. Horses, of course, were not native to the ocean, but Poseidon insisted. If he was to be god of the sea, then horses would swim. Salt water would belong to him. But so would hooves and bridles and bridled waves. The salt fountain then takes on an added layer of meaning. It wasn't just a failed gift. It was a declaration, a fusion of symbols. A horse is powerful, like a storm. Water is wild, like a stallion. The two could not be separated in Poseidon's mind. In his mythology, now, let's shift the lens to the human side of things. The Greeks, who worshipped Poseidon, were aware of this tangled symbolism. His temples, especially in coastal regions, like Sunyang, Isthmia, and Hellike, were built on cliffs or near harbors. His festivals often included chariot races, horse sacrifices, or saltwater rituals. In fact, some scholars suggest that Poseidon was worshipped as a horse god even before he became firmly associated with the sea. This theory comes from the fact that many early Indo-European cultures had gods tied to horses and sky, and Poseidon. Name possibly derives from Poses Lord, and Da Earth may originally have been an earth or fertility deity, only later becoming the sea god we know. In these earlier traditions, Poseidon's connection to horses made more sense. He wasn't a god who created horses as an afterthought. He was always the horse god, with the sea added later. Perhaps as maritime cultures developed, which brings us back to the salt fountain, to the Greeks, especially in later classical times. The spring on the Acropolis was a theological riddle. Why would a sea god offer a city a fountain with undrinkable water? Why salt instead of fresh? Why not a tidal miracle or a fleet of fish, or even, say, seafood? The answer may be that Poseidon wasn't thinking practically. He was thinking symbolically. Salt water was his essence. Horses were his pride. The fountain, then, was not a utility, was a signature, like a king stamping his ring on wax. A bold, useless flourish that said, "I was here, and I should have." The Athenians, of course, never forgot this. Every year, during the Panathenaic festival celebration in honor of Athena, they reenacted her victory over Poseidon. But they also maintained Poseidon's shrine. The salt spring was left, alone, even tended to. Rituals were held for him, not because he won, but because he was dangerous to ignore. After all, Poseidon was god of earthquakes. Ignore his salt fountain too long, and the ground might rumble beneath your feet. This duality honoring Athena for her wisdom, and Poseidon for his wrath, was at the heart of Athenian religious life. One brought peace and shade, the other waves and cracks. And it wasn't just Athens. In many Greek Peleus city-states, the gods were not cleanly divided into good and bad. They were all powerful, all moody, all capable of blessing or destroying. So it made sense to keep even the sore losers happy. And Poseidon, as one scholar put it, was the ultimate sore loser. But that didn't make him less worthy of worship. Quite the opposite. In the quiet flow of a salt fountain, the Athenians heard his voice. Not loud, not victorious, but constant. They remembered the hoofbeats of a divine horse, echoing through stone, and they remembered that even the gods sometimes wanted to be loved. So far, we've seen Poseidon as an innovator, the creator of the horse, the builder of the salt fountain, and the ever-jealous uncle of the Olympian pantheon. But let's not forget, Poseidon wasn't just the god of the sea. He was also the earth shaker, the bringer of tremors and cracks and collapses. And in the end, it's this quieter power, the ability to unsettle the very ground, that may help explain the full story of his salt fountain and why it lingered so long in the Athenian mind. Let's go back for a moment to the Acropolis. That rocky hill was more than just the heart of Athens. It was a stage, an altar, a kind of living museum. On one end stood the Parthenon, towering and white. On the other, tucked to the side, was the Erechtheion. This was the temple that housed both Athena's sacred olive tree and Poseidon's salt spring. The two gifts, side by side, like offerings in a cosmic dispute, never truly settled. The Erechtheion is strange by design. It bends to the contours of the rock. It twists and splits, with porches jutting out at odd angles. It doesn't follow the usual symmetry of Greek temples, and that's because it was built, in part, to preserve things, to carefully enclose old sacred spots, including the marks where Poseidon's trident was said to have struck the rock and opened the salty spring. Imagine standing there, the stone beneath your feet, rumbling faintly in your imagination. A god's temper preserved in architecture. The olive tree outside rustling, calm and silvery. The spring inside bubbling with briny determination. This was not a place of triumph. It was a place of compromise, and compromise, especially in Greek religion, was often the safest course of action. You see, the Greeks didn't expect their gods to be fair. The gods were powerful, beautiful, clever, terrifying, but they weren't moral. Worship was a strategy, not a moral act. You offered to the gods, not because they were just, but because they might destroy you if you didn't. And Poseidon was the god you did not want to anger. That's why his shrines dotted coastlines. That's why seafarers poured wine into the waves before every voyage. That's why even a city that had chosen Athena as its patron still kept Poseidon's salt fountain carefully roped off, reverently maintained, tucked inside a crooked temple on their most sacred hill. To neglect that spring would be to tempt the tectonic plate beneath you. So, the salt fountain persisted. Over time, it became a sort of quiet symbol of defeat. Yes, but also of warning. A reminder that power doesn't need victory to matter. That even a sulking god could be dangerous, even when his gift was rejected. Interestingly, later generations of Athenians began to see the fountain in a new light. It became not just a relic of a myth, but a geological curiosity. In some accounts, they claimed the fountain made a strange sound, soft, bubbling, or moaning, like a whisper from beneath the earth. Geologists today speculate that small fissures or underground water channels might have created those effects. But to the ancient Athenians, it was simpler. Poseidon was speaking. His presence wasn't just in the sea anymore. It was under them. The god who had tried to win their city with waves and horses now lurked beneath their temples and homes. This lingering awareness shaped their stories in dramas and poems. Poseidon appears again and again, not just as a sea god, but as a force of judgment. He punishes Odysseus for blinding the Cyclops. He drowns Hippolytus when his father makes a rash vow. He shakes the earth when people forget their debts. And all of these stories echo with a single lesson. Poseidon doesn't like being ignored. Their single quotes, even a strange myth from the region of Helic, another city that honored Poseidon. According to ancient sources, Helique was a prosperous coastal city in the northern Peloponnese. It had a famous temple to Poseidon and was known for its devotion to him. But one winter night, around 373 BCE, the ground began to shake. The sea pulled back, then surged forward. In moments, the entire city was swallowed gone beneath waves. And mud, Plato mentions this. So do others. Helic was never rebuilt. The survivors claimed it was divine punishment, Poseidon reclaiming what was his. For centuries, sailors said you could still hear the city's bells ringing under the sea. That fish swam through its streets. Now, whether or not Poseidon caused that earthquake is, of course, a matter of belief. But the association stuck. Even centuries later, Roman writers used Helic as a cautionary tale. Athens remembered it too. They didn't want to be the next Helic. So, the salt fountain stayed, even when it no longer made sounds, even when the olive tree had to be replanted. After wars, even when new gods and new empires arrived, there's a kind of quiet magic in that, isn't there? That a monument to rejection became a monument to memory. That a spring of Sol, eternally useless, undrinkably, lasted. The heroes and tyrants and philosophers who once climbed the same hill. And maybe that's the final lesson of Poseidon's jealous fountain, that sometimes what lasts isn't the gift that wins, but the one we dare not forget. So the next time you walk past a cracked stone, or hear a gurgle in the pipes, or feel the faintest tremble in your bones. Imagine, for a moment, that a god once stood there, salty, bitter, proud, and still listening. In the grand sweep of Byzantine history, one tends to hear about emperors in purple robes, grand mosaics in domed churches, and complicated theological debates that sparked riots in the streets. But far from the marble halls of Constantinople and the golden ceilings of Hagia Sophia, there was a quieter kind of science brewing in the kitchens of elderly women. Yes, science, though they might never have used the word. These were the grandmothers, aunts, and aging widows of the Byzantine world. Women who had spent decades stirring pots, drying herbs, muttering prayers, and interpreting small domestic signs as if they were messages from heaven. For most of them, formal education was inaccessible. Their world was not written in books or scrolls, but in broth and steam and the creak of shutters on a stormy afternoon. And one of their strangest, most quietly persistent habits was this: making soup to forecast the weather, not just during the weather, for the weather. You see, the Byzantines, those Eastern heirs to the Roman Empire, lived in a world where weather prediction wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was a question of survival. Crops needed rain, but not too much. Markets thrived on dry days. Olive oil production could be ruined by a surprise frost. And travel on foot, mule, or boat was all at the mercy of the sky. The empire spanned a wide range of climates, from the humid heat of Egypt to the snowy highlands of Anatolia. Yet most common folk had no access to the fancy astrological calculations used in the imperial courts. No charts, no celestial measurements, no fancy dials pointing to rain or shine. Instead, they turned to the tools they had, and for many older women in the rural provinces, and even in the tightly packed neighborhoods of Constantinople, that meant turning to the soup pot. Imagine, if you will, a small kitchen in a stone house on the edge of a village near Thessaloniki. It's a gray morning in early spring. The shutters are closed against the wind. On a low brazier, a clay pot simmers. Inside is a simple lentil soup, nothing fancy, but the woman watching it, let's call her Eleni, is not just cooking. She is watching, truly observing. She notes the way the bubbles rise. Are they even and slow, fast and erratic? She drops in a small pinch of dried sage. One of her trusted weather sand watches how it disperses. If it floats, she nods. If it sinks, she frowns. And if it swirls before settling well, that might mean rain within 3 days. There were, in fact, dozens of small signs like this. Some families even had their own soup signs passed down like recipes. A film on the top of a pot meant wind. A rapid boil on low heat could suggest pressure changes in the air. A slightly metallic smell could mean rain was coming, perhaps due to shifts in humidity reacting with the pot's minerals. None of this was officially recorded, of course. These women weren't publishing cookbooks on meteorology. Their knowledge was oral, instinctive, and deeply localized. What held true in one mountain village might not apply in a fishing town, but each had her rules, developed through repetition, memory, and the shared mutterings of old women bent over pots. You might think this all sounds quaint, maybe even silly, but in some ways, it wasn't so different from the early scientific methods emerging in more formal settings. Empirical observation, repeating processes, testing outcomes, drawing conclusions. These were things the weather soup women did every single day. They just didn't wear robes or hold titles. They wore aprons, and their laboratories smelled like garlic and parsley. Interestingly, some of their methods were surprisingly accurate, not because they tapped into some forgotten mystical truth, but because they were very good at noticing patterns. For example, a storm system approaching might cause barometric pressure to drop slightly, which in turn might alter the way water boiled, how steam behaved, or how dry ingredients reacted in the pot in the absence of tools. The body and kitchen became the barometer. My knees ache, one might say. And the soup is too thick. There'll be thunder before evening. And often there was dot in Constantinople itself, where urban life added its own complexities. Soup forecasting took on even more poetic forms. Some households used the 12 nights, the 12 days from Christmas to Epiphany, to cook a different soup each day and match it with a month of the coming year. If the lentil soup on the 4th day foamed strangely, April would be stormy. If the chickpeas on the 7th day refused to soften, July would be dry. This practice was called karaspudia, blend of kairos, the opportune moment, and spudazo, to observe, to take care. And while we can't know how widespread the term was, it appears in a handful of monastic texts, always attributed to the wisdom of old women. Of course, monks and scholars often mocked this sort of knowledge. There are Byzantine letters from learned men, complaining, sometimes with exasperated affection, that their mothers or aunts refused to let them travel because the garlic didn't boil straight that morning, or because the onion skins cracked too easily in the broth. But those same men might also stay home, just in case. That's the thing about soup-based prophecy. Wasn't harmful. It didn't cost gold or threaten empires. It was quiet, personal and harmlessly cautious. A grandmother watching the weather through the lid of a pot wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to keep her family dry, her goats safe, and her lentils from souring on a bad day. And over time, these practices blended with superstition, with folk healing, and with faith. A cross drawn in steam, a whispered prayer stirred with the ladle. These women weren't simply trying to know the weather. They were trying to live with it, to understand the rhythms of the world in the most humble and immediate way possible, through soup and perhaps. When we think of science, we forget how much of it started like this, not with equations, but with attention, not with certainty, but with a quiet willingness to wait and watch and wonder, which makes you wonder, was it really nonsense, or just another kind of knowing? And what might we discover, even today, if we watched our own kitchens a little more closely? If the first chapter of this curious tradition belonged to the kitchen itself, a quiet observatory of steam and simmer, then the second chapter belongs to the ingredients. Because if you're going to predict the sky using soup, it matters quite a bit what you put in the pot in Byzantine households. Soup was not simply nourishment. It was a living thing, responsive and symbolic. And the broth, like a cloudy mirror, reflected more than just the weather. It reflected history, memory, and mood. Let's return for a moment to Eleni, the imagined grandmother from Section 1. Her family's go-to weather soup might be a blend of lentils, wild onions, dried oregano, and a bone, preferably from a sheep slaughtered on a feast day. The superstition was clear. Bones from holy meals had more predictive power. They carried memory, and it wasn't just any bone. The preferred choice, the shoulder blade. Why? Because across ancient and medieval cultures, from Babylon to Rome and through the Byzantine Empire, the shoulder blade had long been used in a practice called scapulomancy, the reading of signs and omens in animal bones, especially through the way they cracked, blistered, or smoked over fire. The Byzantines, inheriting beliefs from both Greek and Near Eastern traditions, adapted this quietly into their kitchens. When the soup simmered, women might watch to see. If the shoulder blade shifted slightly in the pot, a clatter was a warning. A silent, steady rest meant calm skies. Some even removed the bone halfway through the cook and held it up to the light, peering at the subtle fractures or bubbled pockets that had formed under heat. Did a bubble near the curve? Rain in 2 days. A clean surface, no change, a fracture along the edge. Winds from the east. Of course, these signs were deeply regional. The knowledge wasn't written down in books, but passed in stories. Once you see this mark, One might say to a granddaughter, holding a brown bone with reverence, "It's just like the one from the spring. We couldn't harvest olives." And the girl would nod, uncertain if she truly saw it, but she would remember. In other parts of the empire, especially along the Black Sea coast, fish heads were used, not as tools of fortune necessarily, but as indicators. A fisherman's wife might stew a pot with bones and heads from a small catch of anchovies, then peer into the broth for the telltale signs. A greasy sheen that spread quickly could mean the sea was warming. A slow thickening film, sluggish and hard to stir back in, was a warning of oncoming cold. One recipe fragment, preserved in a 10th century Constantinopolitan herbal text, reads more like a weather chant than a culinary note. Boil the broth with skin of river fish. If the skin rises, the sky clears. If it clings to the bottom, storms come. If it floats halfway and turns, do not travel. We do not know if this was ever accurate, but we do know that it was remembered. That's something. The Byzantines also paid close attention to evaporation without knowing the term, of course. A shallow pot with a wide mouth was said to speak louder than a deep one. This was because the speed and direction of steam could change subtly with shifts in air pressure, temperature, and humidity. An especially humid day might cause the rising vapors to hang low, curling like mist over the pot instead of rising. To an experienced grandmother, this meant heavy air, a sure sign of rain. Some households placed a metal spoon in the pot and leaned it against the rim. The idea was that if the spoon rattled more than usual while the pot simmered quietly, the wind outside was shifting. A sudden knock meant a sudden gust. This might sound absurd now, but remember, before thermometers, barometers, or reliable calendars, people used everything available to them to track the world. And soup hot, responsive, ever-changing, was oddly perfect for this. In addition to meat or fish, herbs and legumes were also key. Dried chickpeas, for example, were known to absorb moisture differently depending on ambient humidity. On days when they rehydrated sluggishly, older cooks said a dry spell was coming. On days when they softened too fast, they warned of air too thick, often a phrase for muggy, stormy conditions. Beans, especially white broad beans, were thought to whisper. That is, the soft popping noises they made when cooking were listened to carefully. A steady rhythm was ideal. Popping that grew louder, faster, or inconsistent might indicate incoming lightning, an odd association, but one documented in village songs and proverbs. When the beans dance like drums, Zeus is rolling his wheels. Then there was salt, perhaps, the strangest weather tool of them all. in one particularly persistent folk practice. Grandmothers would sprinkle coarse salt over the surface of a finished soup and count how many grains floated, sunk, or stayed suspended on the edge. Some said 3 floating grains was an omen of wind. More than 5 meant hail. If none floated, it was a warning of the air being tired, which loosely translated to stagnant weather, often tied to fog or oppressive stillness. While modern science might scoff, there's actually some truth to these observations. Salts can dissolve at different speeds depending on temperature, density of the broth, and mineral content factors subtly influenced by climate and environment. In monasteries and isolated convents, where the rhythms of daily life were even more dependent on good weather for growing and preserving food, some nuns developed detailed charts for these signs. Most were never published, but a few fragments survive in marginally scribbled notes in the corners of prayer books and herbal manuals. One anonymous nun in Cappadocia wrote, "If steam curls rightward and garlic clings to the rim, do not dry laundry today. The sun will hide." It's oddly domestic, humble, and sweet. But for that community, it was essential knowledge. And here lies, perhaps, the most beautiful truth of all. These practices were not just practical, they were relational. A way for people, especially women, to feel connected to the world, to notice its moods, to pass on care not just through food, but through attention. Today, we check our phones. Back then, they checked their pots, and it makes you wonder, when did we stop listening to the little signs? And how much of the world have we tuned out in the name of progress? By now, you know the basics. An old pot of soup could be a surprising source of meteorological insight in the Byzantine world. We've boiled our way through bone readings, steam watching, salt scattering, and lentil listening. But the heart of the story, the truly boring but deeply human truth is what this practice tells us about how people used to live. The Byzantine Empire, especially in its middle centuries, say, from the 9th to 12th centuries, was a world balanced between the fading echo of Rome and the rising chants of Orthodox liturgy. It was an empire made not of steel and conquest, but of routine, religion, rumor, and roast garlic. It was a world held together in many places by women, particularly older women, grandmothers, widows, aunts, and nuns. These were the keepers of domestic memory, agricultural timing, religious rituals, and local wisdom. Their role wasn't glamorous, and most of their names have been lost. But they were, in many ways, the unofficial timekeepers of the empire. And they watched the sky. In soup, there's something beautifully quiet about in Constantinople, the capital. Such rustic traditions might have seemed quaint or even superstitious. The urban elite were more concerned with the latest court intrigue, ecclesiastical debates, or iconography controversies. But even among the nobility, weather had a role, and often, food preparation still followed the rhythms of the seasons. Some letters from noble women show an unexpected crossover. A 10th century epistle from Theoctist, a minor aristocrat, to her sister in Thessaloniki, includes this brief line: "The lentils would not foam last Thursday, and the cook refused to bake. She insists there will be wind." She was right. The sails did not leave the harbor. It's a passing detail, not the main point of the letter. But it reveals that this folk wisdom, whether believed or merely tolerated, drifted upward into even the marble corridors of Byzantine villas in monasteries. Weather mattered even more, and soup was a regular feature of the ascetic diet. In Mount Athos, monks consumed a strict rotation of legumes, boiled greens, and fish broth. Some monastic records even record meals alongside marginal notes on the weather. Pea stew, with onion sky, heavy no sun, after none, the 9th hour. Whether the stew predicted the gloom or simply mirrored it, it's impossible to say. But the association stuck by the 13th century. These traditions began to fade, not entirely, but they were no longer recorded. The rise of more formal calendars increased literacy, and the importing of Arab and Persian scientific instruments meant that people began trusting sundials and stars more than soup. But even as the empire shifted, cracked, and eventually fell, to the Ottomans in 1453, echoes of the old practice remained in some Greek villages, especially inland ones. Grandmothers would continue to say things like, "If the lentils don't boil, the sky won't either. A pot that bubbles too fast brings storms. Never cook chickpeas on an east wind, touts the flavor and the air." We might call these sayings silly, but what they really reflect is attention to the environment, to patterns, and to time. And there's something oddly scientific, in a quiet way, about that dot. Today, we often think of science as something separate from everyday life, a domain of labs, satellites, and university degrees. But in the Byzantine kitchen, observation was constant. Pattern recognitions, what weather forecasters today might call longitudinal, anecdotal data, was embedded into. Every pot stirred and every window watched. Of course, there's another layer beyond weather. Soup was also a form of memory. Grandmothers would say that the flavor of a soup changed not only with ingredients or weather, but with mood, the cook's mood, the family's mood, the household's mood. Some called this the warmth of the wrist. A bitter soup might mean something was wrong, tension in the air, unspoken grief, or a restless night of bad dreams. So a bubbling broth was more than a tool. It was a barometer of the family's soul. Even the timing of soup making followed subtle customs. Certain villages avoided making lentil soup on Wednesdays, not for religious reasons, but because it foams like anger midweek. Others only made bone broth on feast days and said it was not for the ordinary sky. And children were taught not through charts or books, but through rhythm and repetition. Watch the window, stir the pot, listen for the sound that means wind, smell for the scent that means dry air. Notice if the spoon trembles. Look to the rising steam. All of these quiet signs of a world observed carefully, which brings us to the final idea, the most boring, but perhaps most important thing of all. Attention is the root of care. When people paid attention to their soup, they were not just predicting the weather. They were caring for the future. They were protecting their family. They were preparing for uncertainty with what little they had: bones, beans, herbs. Heat. There was no Doppler radar, no 5-day forecast, no emergency alert system. There was only the grandmother, the kitchen, the pot, and the weather outside. And maybe that's why the tradition held on for so long, not because it was scientifically precise, but because it created a sense of readiness, a way to say, we don't know what's coming, but we're watching, and that watching, however slow, however small, is a form of wisdom that modernity may have forgotten. So tonight, if you hear a pot simmering in your kitchen, take a moment, watch the steam, stir slowly. For a moment that you can hear the wind whisper in the broth, and ask yourself, what might the soup be telling you?